Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to learn a little bit about a really cool, rare, endemic plant that is found only in two locations on Santa Cruz Mountains and down towards the Little Sur River drainage in Big Sur. So today we're going to be talking about Dudley's lousewort. Scientific name is Pedicularis dudleyi. And on the right there, you'll just see a little close-up photo of a really beautiful inflorescence, which is another way of saying a conglomerate of flowers. So each little flower is attached to kind of a single stalk coming out of a rosette of leaves. Let's see if I can do this slide. There we go. All right. So just a quick overview. It seems like some of you aren't familiar with this species as others. So Dudley's lousewort is in the Oroboncaceae family, which is the broom rape family. For those of you who maybe are more familiar with things like paintbrushes, like coastal Monterey paintbrush or owl's clover, those are other plants found in the Oroboncaceae family. And the family is kind of known for having a really cool flower morphology that has evolved really specifically with certain pollinators. And also, it has a lot of plants in it that are parasitic. So actually, they're either fully parasitic or hemiparasitic, meaning they have a root system that either taps into a plant and completely steals nutrients and water from other plants, or maybe half and half, where it does a little bit of photosynthesis, but also draws some nutrients from other plants. So, kind of dropping down in the phylogeny or the cladistics, we'd say the genus is Pedicularis, which is a Latin from a Latin root, actually means of louse, of lice. So it actually there's some anecdotal evidence that the genus kind of came from the Linnaeus period when people would observe livestock eating plants in the Pedicularis genera and then having an outbreak of lice, and they then named it Pedicularis. So uh, maybe some of you are familiar with Pedicularis densiflora, which is also colloquially called Indian warrior or warrior's plume. It's more of like a chaparral species. It's really showy red inflorescence, and that's also in the Pedicularis family. So you could also call that a lousewort if you wanted to. Most Pedicularis plants are actually found in Asia. I think there's like 500 and some odd plants in the Asia region. There's somewhere between 30 and 35 species in North America and only 12 in California. Um, and then the actual species name, so Pedicularis dudleyi, as you might suspect, as some of you are probably familiar with Dudley, and that is named after William Dudley, who is the Stanford professor and kind of one of the founding fathers, we should say, of Big Basin Redwoods State Park. He was a really prominent botanist in the area. He discovered a bunch of plants. They named the entire Dudleya genus after him, the live forevers, the coastal succulents that you may be used to seeing. So the species was actually kind of cataloged by, I think it's Alfred Russell was the botanist who cataloged the type specimen in Portola Redwoods State Park in 1906. And he, in honor of William Dudley, he named it after him. Dudley was actually one of the first people to find and sort of describe the species, but he didn't actually submit the type specimen to kind of officially classify it. It's botanical kind of bureaucracy. So just going down to, maybe some of you are familiar with California Native Plant Society's rare plant rankings. This species is given a 1B2 ranking, which, if we could spend a whole presentation talking about rankings and listings and ESA, Endangered Species Act stuff, but I'll just say 1B2 essentially means that it's relatively rare in California. So you can't just walk, you won't just see it walking on a random hike out in the forest or in, kind of mixed conifer near chaparral. You have to go to a very specific area to find this species. Um, and then the actual California listing, so this is like CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, it lists Pedicularis dudleyi, or Dudley's lousewort, is a rare plant, and that's based off of the Native Plant Protection Act of 1977. And it's sort of a funny bureaucratic oversight in some ways because the Native Plant Protection Act of 1977 came before California developed its own Endangered Species Act known as CISA, California Endangered Species Act. And since CISA was created, it actually provides more legal protections to the plants under it. And there are 60 something odd plants on the Native Plant Protection Act of 90, or sorry, of 77. And they're kind of stuck on that list. They can't figure out a way to get them off that list and onto the more protective CISA list. So our lousewort is actually it's still protected as a rare plant under this 1977 act, but it would actually be more protected in theory if they could get it onto the California Endangered Species Act or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Federal Endangered Species Act. I always like to tell people that the type specimen was actually found in Portola Redwoods State Park. The note on the voucher that was collected actually says it was found somewhere near the Iverson cabin, but it's not very specifically like the cabin site, which is, you can walk in Portola Redwood State Park and go to the old cabin site. Actually, it's more likely that it's right at the entrance road. So right at the junction between the Middleton track and as you hang a right onto Portola Redwood State Park Road, there's a big patch of Pedicularis dudleyi, and that is actually I think more likely the type specimen where it came from. And then I mentioned this earlier before some of you showed up, but there was two other specimens collected in the late 1800s, one in like 1884 and another I think in 1903 or no, sorry, 1893. So 1884 and 1893, one of them was in Aptos. It just says Aptos River drainage, but the GPS coordinate actually has it somewhere near like modern Forest of Nicene Marks. So our Nicene Marks State Park. And then the other one just mentions the San Lorenzo River drainage. And so currently, if you look on the screen, you'll see on the map these 2 points, Portola Redwood State Park and the Little Sur River. Those are the only two places currently that we find this plant anymore. So the fact that there were vouchers collected in the late 1800s in Nicene and potentially somewhere near Felton or Henry Cowell or Fall Creek or something like that, I mean, it means it used to be more widespread than it is currently. And that'll become more important later on in the story. So a little bit about the natural history of Pedicularis dudleyi or Dudley's lousewort. Just it's an herbaceous, meaning just it doesn't create any woody secondary growth. It is perennial. It lives year round, although we'll talk about it later, but not above ground year round. And it is like other species in the Oroboncaceae family, it is hemiparasitic. And so it actually has a taproot known as a hostoria that kind of comes down from the rosette into the ground and eventually finds a host, taps into said host's root system, and takes carbohydrates, nutrients, and potentially water. And then, so I mentioned it's deciduous. Like we think of, some of our riparian woodland species like willows and alders as being deciduous. Pedicularis dudleyi doesn't just lose its leaves, but it actually fully kind of senesces or dies back and goes underground and is just in the wintertime. You cannot see it. It is completely underground. It is, by all intensive purposes, just gone. But it is just below the ground in the form of a root system that then reemerges later in the year. So it's you can see in the bottom photo there, it has a rosette. That just means kind of a whirl of leaves that kind of look like a spiral. It's pinnately compound, so it has a single axis. Single axis that then has the little leaflets kind of coming off each side, like you might expect like a fern, like pretty common fern leaf morphology. A lot of people mistake it for a fern when they see it and it's not flowering. We all know that ferns don't flower, so if you see a fern that has a flower on it, you may suspect that you're looking at a particular dudleyi if you're in Portola Redwoods State Park. And the inflorescences themselves are really cool. They're indeterminate inflorescences, which means that they don't necessarily have the same number of flowers each time. They, depending on the kind of conditions, how much moisture it has, nutrients, how compact the soil is or not, it could have a really good year and have an inflorescence with, 30 to 40 flowers, or it could have one that only has two or three. The flowers start out white, and as they age, they turn pink. So you can see in that photo, there's one inflorescence closest to the photo. It actually has white on top as it's still kind of like growing its flowering stalk. And then as they get older, they turn pink, and eventually they wither and turn brown. And then eventually the flower itself falls off. The seeds begin to set, and it creates four seeds per flower. It's really fun to go look at one. It literally looks like four little popcorn kernels in this little cup. And the photo on top is a kind of up close, zoomed in of the seeds themselves. And we can talk about some of the cool seed morphology later, but you'll just notice that it has this kind of honeycomb lattice covering it. And that we'll kind of talk about how that may be important for seed dispersal later. A little bit about the habitat of the Dudley's lousewort. As you might suspect, growing in Portola Redwoods State Park, for any of you who have been there, there's not a ton of light unless you're kind of down by the river, like looking straight up, or through like a PG&E power line cut, or around a structure where there can't possibly be a tree growing. So it really likes diffused light. Now, that is to say, it does need light. It can't grow in complete canopy cover. So we find it sort of in the Goldilocks lighting scenario where there's large trees producing some canopy cover, some umbrage, but if it's in like really thick, dense second or third growth redwood forests where there's like tons of plants just growing next to each other, or really thick huckleberry, for instance, we don't find Dudley's lousewort growing, or if we do, they're really reduced in size with only one or two leaves and almost never flowering. Um, if there's too much light, we've had situations where, due to our own pruning or a landslide or a wind throw event, so like a big storm, wind comes in and knocks a tree over, produces a big hole in the canopy, that sun comes in, kind of bakes the soil beneath it, and we'll see a reduction in the number of louseworts in a given area. So it definitely is sensitive to light. Whether or not that's just because of soil moisture is sort of still up in the air. So that comes to our next one. It's moist conditions. It really needs sort of higher humidities, moist conditions, which you would see in light to medium litter as well. So it needs some sort of forest litter to kind of hold soil moisture. It can't just grow on, like, let's say bedrock per se. But interestingly enough, it does like slopes. And the reason it likes sloped habitats, like right here, this photo is actually a road cut. And this is, so the road is on the left, and then this is sort of like the right hand road cut if you're driving on your right there. And the reason that it grows in these areas is because it isn't a very good competitor, and its seeds don't germinate super well in really thick litter. And so it actually needs these steep slopes, as you might imagine, don't accumulate a lot of debris. Kind of think of like the steep aspect of a mountain with snow and how there's frequent avalanches. The same thing happens in steep slopes in a forest. They don't accumulate as much litter. So flatter areas in a forest like have, almost 2 feet of duff, and you get very little germinating. And then steeper areas have a lot less litter. And then road cut banks or sides of trails or riverbanks, which may be its natural sort of habitat, you get really light litter accumulation, better germination habitat, and for particular Dudley, it seems to be relatively important. Another thing to just mention is redwood needles don't break apart really easily. Like if you think of like when you find a redwood needle on the ground, it's often still attached to its central axis, and it kind of, they stack on top of each other and they really smother everything beneath them. The plants that can grow in thick redwood canopy are very specialized to growing in thick duff. Pediculus dudleyi does not really jive with thick redwood litter. However, mixed conifer, a little bit of redwood, but mostly Douglas fir, Douglas fir needles break off and kind of form like a light peppering, and the plants can actually grow through it pretty easily. So we tend to find it more associated with Douglas fir than we do with straight redwood groves. As I said before, it's hemiparasitic, so it does need a host. Some hypotheses of plants that it kind of taps into are Douglas fir, redwood, and huckleberry. We'll talk a little bit about one study where they actually dug up one of the tap roots, and it was tapped into a redwood. When it grows in clumps, we'll talk about seed dispersal later as well, but it does a lot better when it kind of grows in a colony. If you find a single plant out all on its lonesome, they don't tend to do as well. Like I'll see one 3, 4 years in a row, and then something will happen. It just doesn't really, it's not as resilient to environmental change or herbivory or just sort of like climactic variations. So stronger together for particular Studley. And last but not least, for the habitat, it really needs some form of intermediate disturbance, which is really important for management considerations because a lot of rare plants are almost protected into extinction. So they're given, California Endangered Species Act protection of threatened or endangered, and then it becomes really hard to touch them, to collect seed, to do exclusion experiments, to really do anything with them besides kind of put a snow globe over them and say, "Oh, look at it. Look as this lovely plant goes extinct." So it's really ironic that this plant almost exclusively grows adjacent to the roads and trails that we whack and beat to death, on a near annual basis. It loves road cuts. It grows on most of the trails. Um, and it used to be more prevalent down by the riverbanks as well, I think, when the forest canopy was a little bit less dense. So when there was more frequent low intensity fire, as another hypothesis for how this plant used to be more abundant. So as with many stories in California's natural history, fire exclusion has affected this species as well. Same with logging, but in a different way. So a little bit about the growth cycle. I mentioned that it's deciduous. It is perennial, but it is deciduous. That bottom photo shows a mature plant that was, a big old rosette with a flower the previous year, and then it died back, and then in February and March they emerge. So kind of it's spring, spring is starting to come. It's the soil is really wet. The light is starting to kind of come. The sun is getting a little more vertical in the sky, diffusing through the forest floor, and you'll see these little sprouts start to come back out from the taproot. And you can see actually right below it in the photo, those are all seeds from the previous year as well that are starting to germinate. So the seed dispersal mechanism for this species isn't super technical, at least for part of it. And so most of the seeds just germinate right around the plants themselves. So the flowers pop up March to June. So we're just past the flowering period. You may still, if you go out there today, you probably will still see kind of the inflorescence itself, but maybe not with like a pink flower to it. You might see sort of those senesced gray or brown flowers. The seeds are starting to set right about now. So end of July, but mostly August through September, the seeds start to harden and pop out of the flowers themselves, fall to the ground, and then they reseed September, October into the fall. So they literally completely die back. They go totally underground and they're completely dormant from October through January. And that just means that if you do want to go to Portola Redwoods State Park to see this plant, I would highly recommend kind of going sometime between March and June if you want to see this species flowering. Or if you really want to get into it, you can come out kind of during all phases of the year, pick a single spot to kind of observe it and see it through its different phases. It's really interesting to watch. Oh, I guess one more thing from this slide. The top photo, those are all cotyledons, or like the sort of baby leaves that come out just directly out of the seed. But one of those little cotyledons in the bottom right of the photo has a true leaf kind of sprouting out from the center. So that seedling actually produced a true leaf in its first year. All right. if you thought that was dense before, get ready. We're going to talk a little bit about genetics. So I mentioned that there were two populations. So there's a population that's found in Portola Redwoods State Park, and there's a population that's found on the Little Sur River. And there was actually a third population by Hearst Castle, but before San Jose State did this study, someone else kind of came in and looked at the morphology and was just like, you know what, this Hearst Castle population is so different. They ended up naming it Pedicularis reginsiae. And so that's just not a part of this story anymore. But between the Little Sur population and the Portola population, we're pretty sure morphologically they're very similar in growth habit and flower morphology and everything. And so they're both pedicularis Dudleyi. But when we took, and I should say the royal we is mostly Ben Carter's lab at San Jose State, took um, genetic samples, they found that the Portola population and Little Sur population were very genetically different. So much so that, we should not be crossing those seeds or crossing. Obviously, they're not sharing genetic information. They are so separate. I mean, you think about how far away and how many river drainages and urban areas they'd have to cross, for a bumblebee to pollinate those two different flowers. But really interestingly, the Little Sur population actually had two subpopulations itself. So that top photo with the river on it shows kind of the pink and the blue. The blue is upstream and the pink is downstream. And somewhere in the middle, there's a break where they're not sharing genetic information anymore and they're starting to diverge genetically, which is really interesting. And that top colored bar at the very top of the screen just shows you kind of the difference in genetic information. The green is Portola, the blue is the upper Little Sur population, the pink is the lower Little Sur population. And then this was really interesting because it actually proved one other theory. Why is this species so rare? So they kind of gave it three models. They either said, well, some species, some plants are just rare from the get-go. They speciate and they're rare. There's just not a lot of them, and so they have kind of low genetic diversity, and they just kind of linger in the background, and they kind of limp along through existence. Until we discover them and write them down and so on and so forth. That was kind of theory one. Theory two was there was a recent bottleneck event. So something like logging in, the 1800s that it wasn't abundant per se, but they were more common. And then logging got rid of most of their habitat, clear cut logging, that is. And now we see really low genetic diversity and low abundance. Or third theory was maybe there was a bottleneck event way in the distant past. So they ran all their numbers, did their statistical analysis, and pretty confidently said, based on those three scenarios, that scenario two, aka recent logging event, recent disturbance event, is the reason that Pedicularis dudleyi is so rare today. Um, and the one just other little thing I'll say about this is the genetic diversity for the Portola population is incredibly low. So it is like not a lot of genetic diversity there. And when we think of diversity, we think of resilience. So as far as when we talk about threats later on in the presentation, we'll come back to low genetic diversity being a potential hurdle to overcome or just manage. Another study that came out of the Carter lab, they did a population census, which was great to kind of double check our counting that we do in district, and found very similar numbers of patches. There are 22, I count 24 patches in the park itself, meaning like kind of independent clumps, but they're all sort of, sharing genetic information, we think, aka they're being pollinated by the same insects. There were about 1,500 plants, 2,400 seedlings. If you think some aspects of your job are boring, counting seedlings is incredibly boring and really hard and makes pretty much anyone who's doing it think that they have ADHD because you lose track almost constantly of where you were and what's going on. So I commend the grad students who counted 2,400 Pidou seedlings. Really exciting though that they got 1,500 mature plants, and that's just separated with flowering plants and just mature rosettes that we kind of separate those two things out. The pollinators they observed were two native bumblebees, so Bombus sicensis and Bombus edwardsii. Those are two native bumblebees that are found in Portola Redwoods State Park and all over the Santa Cruz Mountains. They're not rare. They visited the flowers a lot. It was clear, very clear that pollination was not a limiting factor in Pedicularis dudleyi's life history. So they did a exclusion experiment where they covered flowers with a net to kind of to exclude those bumblebees, and they got zero fruits, so zero seeds. So it's really, and then when their kind of control, their natural pollination, about 80% of the flowers were pollinated. So that's a really high pollination rate, just naturally. So some species, as the pollinators start to die off for one reason or another, the plants themselves don't do so hot as you might expect. But this is not the case for Dudley's lousewort. And also, interestingly enough, they did a hand pollinated experiment where they took the net off of a flower and then hand pollinated each flower with the pollen that they found in the flower itself, and then measured how much seed maturation they got. And they got, around 40%, which means that they can actually self, which is really kind of important to think about for survival. Because if for some reason the pollinators did have a population decline, it means that they could, in theory, still produce seed. Although we didn't test, or the Carter lab did not test the viability of those selfed seeds, so we don't know if they're viable, just that they were produced. But it is an interesting thing to think about. And then also really interestingly, this study found that there was more seed dispersal mechanisms than just gravity and water. So I mentioned before that the kind of the most resilient patches of this plant are growing in clumps, and that's quite literally a flower comes up off of the rosette, it produces seeds, and then this 4 to 6 inch kind of flowering stalk falls over, and that is how far the seeds disperse. And that is generally where you find most of the seedlings and the plants. And so these clumps grow really slowly outwards. However, there is, if they're on a steep bank, they'll sometimes the seeds will roll downhill. So gravity kind of is like the main dispersal mechanism, and water. If the seed rolls into a water course, a ditch, a small stream, a rivulet, the seeds will go downstream. If they find some soil, they find good enough habitat, they can germinate and kind of start a new colony. But really interestingly, yellow jackets were observed coming into the flowers, going in that same honeycomb lattice coating that we were talking about. They grabbed onto that. They sort of scratched at it and almost appeared to be eating it, and then flew away with the seeds. And so about 50, I think it was around 50% of the times that there was a visit from a yellow jacket, it flew away with a seed, which is really interesting seed dispersal mechanism. And actually other studies have been finding that yellow jackets, which most people consider a pest, are really important seed dispersers in California's environment. What they do with the seeds, we don't know. We didn't follow the seeds around per se, but you'd think that they kind of scrape that honeycomb off the side, drop the seed, and potentially, a new population is born. There's some hypotheses that banana slugs would move the seeds around, but actually they kind of come and eat the flowers before the seeds mature. So even if they are sort of like interacting with the plants a lot, that's earlier in the season before the seeds are able to reproduce. And same with ants. Ants are observed all over the plants certain times of the year, but not really removing seeds and moving them around. And then there was also a theory that deer could come and eat the flowers, and if they ate it at just the perfect time, like right when the seeds were mature, that they could potentially kind of scarify or kind of instigate germination in the seed in their gut, and then when they walk away and poop it out, that maybe you'd find seeds along a deer trail. Which from my own personal observations, I have seen some plants along what appear to be deer trails, but just based on the fact that the deer mostly eat the inflorescences before July, I don't know if that's true or not. Um, but the last thing I'll just say about the study is the most important life history stage. So when we think of like seed set to germination, germination to seedling, seedling to immature plant to flowering plant, kind of the limiting stage between that seems to be the seedling, the seed to seedling stage. So just germination in general. So they're producing all this seed and they just weren't seeing a lot of germination. And then of the 2,400 seedlings that they saw, not all those make it to a mature stage as well. So for conservation and management, that's really interesting because we could obviously move seeds around pretty easily and try to get them to spread out with a little human intervention. Interestingly enough, they couldn't get a single seed to germinate in a greenhouse. They tried a lot of different strategies, and the only way they could observe seeds germinating is if they just placed them kind of in a known area next to a plant. So something about the natural environment really sets the cue for these seeds to germinate, which is really interesting. So talking about threats, um, low genetic diversity. We mentioned that the genetic study that the Carter Lab did found that the Portola Redwood Park population is very genetically poor, I guess is one way to put it. Um, which just means that like if you were to have a disease or some sort of outbreak of something like a fungus, a fungal pathogen or something come in, it's not super likely that it would be able to sort of persist. Like all the plants are very similar. Um, and we can't cross this species, or I should say, we shouldn't cross this species with the kind of separate population down in the Little Sur River drainage because they're so genetically dissimilar at this point. So that's just a time. That's like the kind of the risk of bottleneck events is that sometimes you get genetically really low diversity, and oftentimes plants can make it through that phase, but sometimes they don't. So it's one thing to be thinking about. Soil compaction in places where we say that these plants grow next to roads and trails, which is really ironic because they can't grow really well in really, really compact soils, but they do like a little bit of compaction just from uh, the sense of like plant competition. Right next to a trail, you get a little bit more light, a little bit less competition from, let's say, huckleberry or something, because state park trail staff are clearing it frequently. And we'll actually see more Dudley's Lousewort growing adjacent to the trail. But once there's too much compaction, trails like people walking off trail or potentially or cars pulling off of a road into a pullout, we've seen populations start to decline when soils get too compact, and that just has to do with soil moisture and the ability for the plant to persist longer into the summer and fall. Canopy loss, kind of a similar thing, but a different mechanism. Less canopy, more sunlight, more soil drying, and plants don't do so hot. So that bottom photo is just a really good um, reminder that Portola is powered with, is hooked up into the grid. And so all those power lines have to be cleared almost annually, which creates kind of a conflict of interest with when it comes to preserving rare plants. Sometimes PG&E comes through and says we have to clear this tree, otherwise we can't serve the park power. And in the process of clearing the tree, they open up the canopy, they introduce more sunlight to the forest floor, and at times there has been a decrease in the number of Pedicularis dudleyi because of canopy loss. Talked about physical trampling. That's just the photo up top. If you step on a rosette, it doesn't do very well. And that's more than just soil compaction, but actually just knowing where plants are and not walking on them. Um, and then smothering, which just means litter accumulation over time. This kind of has to do with that intermediate disturbance hypothesis we talked about, where um, because of fire suppression, we don't have kind of regular cleaning of the forest floor. So too much litter eventually smothers these plants. They can't really grow through really, really, really dense litter. And potentially it has more to do with germination than it does to like smothering mature plants. Um, we just don't see great germination rates, it appears, in places where the duff is really thick. And then, of course, just it's a park, and the Little Sur population is also by, I think it's a Cutter or Boy Scout camp. So just infrastructure, buildings, power lines, roads, trails, these plants, it's really ironic. It's a bit of a paradox that they need some disturbance. They actually thrive next to roads and trails, but at the same time, sometimes the maintenance of said roads and trails and buildings can affect the plants themselves. And so it's a little bit um, we're trying to find the middle ground of helping the plants when we can, but also still protecting the public safety, tree hazards, and historic structures, and you know, just providing access, which is the dual mission of California state parks. So we get a little bit into management. Um, every year we do a census, or I should say, every year we do a rough count, and then every other year we do a full census, or we try to. Mushtaba, if you're listening, last year we did a full census. This year we did not, so that means next year. Would love to have you out there, and anyone else that's on this call to help us. We don't count seedlings, so hopefully that's a pitch to get you guys to come out and just count flowering stalks and rosettes. Signage. This sign that's actually right here was created by a homeowner in the Middleton tract who kind of found an art scientific illustrator, and it's a really cool sign, and they offered it to us that we could reproduce it with that illustrator's permission. And so we're considering printing these and posting them around to known patches to kind of help spread the word, and also help it so people kind of know where they are and they don't accidentally disturb them. Seed dispersal. So every year I pretty much walk around at a certain time of year and kind of coerce gently the seeds out of the stalks and try to help kind of move them around a little bit. This is all just not super scientific, but we have plans to work with CDFW to obtain the necessary permits to then do seedling trials, move them around, establish populations away or further away from park infrastructure so that they're a little bit more resilient. And then kind of couple that with litter exclusion and pruning, which is just to say that we'll do some light raking in the winter to make sure that the seeds have a place to germinate, potentially even doing some pile burning or small broadcast burns to kind of eat up the duff so that there's better chance for seedling germination. And then light pruning in areas where we're seeing really, really dense overstory to kind of simulate that intermediate disturbance that you might find from a low intensity fire. Um, but yeah, currently the main management is just avoiding them and not doing more harm than good. So here's just an overview map of Portola Redwoods State Park, and all you don't need to look super closely at this, but it's just to kind of show you that we know where most of the patches in the park are, and most of them are along roads and trails. Um, so if you do ever go to the park, we can certainly help you find a patch or two pretty easily, or you could just kind of do your own Easter egg hunt and find one along a road or trail. Here's kind of a zoomed in one, kind of right in the center. You can see the visitor center of the map. You can see there's a patch right next to it, a patch up the road from it, a patch in the Madrone picnic area, and sort of just all over the place. Um, it's not rare in Portola Redwood State Park. It's a pretty common plant that you'd actually run into if you go to the park, but found almost nowhere else. And then the last thing I'll say is I've been spending more time outside of the patches that I know of, and I've been actually finding more and more plants the more I look. So it's a relatively cryptic species. That top left, that was just out in the middle of the forest. And that was actually this Middleton track owner who took me on a tour of his property where he has a bunch of plants. And then he hiked into Portola Redwood State Park, way off the beaten path. And you just see these little, almost look like fern fronds sticking out of the duff. So the plant is growing outside of our infrastructure naturally in certain areas. And then the bottom photo is actually down on Peters Creek, which is really cool because this is how I suspect And most people hypothesize the plant sort of used to move around, and its preferred habitat was kind of inset floodplains adjacent to a river. As you can see, there's very little competition. There's not a lot of duff. It floods when the species is below ground, so it doesn't really affect it. And then the river recedes and they emerge and do their thing. So I think that's it for the immediate presentation, and I am happy to answer any questions that you guys have, if any.